Okay, before I turn it over to Ms. Sparti, I want to set the stage here. You will recall from your high school civics class that in our system of government, the states are the ones with the broad general police power. So in comparison to Congress, the state legislatures have the ability to more broadly legislate within the state. If Congress wants to pass a law, that law must be grounded somewhere in the Constitution. When it comes to environmental law, all too often that is the Commerce Clause that provides the foundation for that law. Most of our major federal environmental statutes somehow, some way enlist the states to work with the federal government to both implement and enforce those laws. And when the states and the federal governments are on the same page, we call that cooperative federalism. But sometimes states go in a direction very different from how the courts interpret what Congress wanted the states to do. And when that happens, so-called cooperative federalism becomes decidedly uncooperative. So, what happens when the state and federal law go in different directions? The Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, which is up on the screen, provides that the laws of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. So, assuming that the federal law is a valid exercise of federal power, then in some circumstances, federal law negates state and local law. The Federal Atomic Energy Act, well, let me go over this first. Here are the various permutations of preemption, and some of you certainly have gone over this in other classes. So there's express preemption. When the federal statute explicitly provides that there is no room for state legislation or regulation, that would be an example of express preemption. An example would be the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, where in no uncertain terms, Congress said that states cannot play a role in the packaging, in the regulation of packaging for the chemicals that fall within the federal act. Then there's field preemption. Field preemption arises when Congress doesn't expressly say so, but state law is nonetheless preempted in an entire field. Field preemption arises when the courts decide that the federal regulatory scheme is so comprehensive, so all-encompassing, that it is reasonable to infer that Congress, even if it didn't actually say so, intended not to leave any room for state regulation. And finally, there's conflict preemption. State law is always preempted to the extent that its enforcement would create an actual conflict with federal law. So that begs the question, as between the federal government and the state governments, which level has the most control over issues surrounding nuclear technology? And the answer is, as is often the case in the law, it depends. The Federal Atomic Energy Act doesn't have a provision comparable to the provision in FIFRA. As such, there is no express preemption. So the Atomic Energy Act does not expressly preempt state law. Furthermore, the act is explicit in acknowledging the state's traditional authority over small bits of sources of radiation, relatively small issues involving radiation. And that then takes us to the US Supreme Court decision in Pacific Gas and Electric versus State Energy Resources Conservation and Development Commission. Because even though it's a 1983 decision, it is still very much the law today. So there is a California law, it's still on the books today, that prohibits the construction of any new nuclear power plant until the California Energy Commission is able to determine that the waste from that plant could be properly managed. The law has amounted to an effective moratorium on the construction of any new nuclear power plant here in California. California argued that the law was necessary to avoid the economic consequences of dealing with the buildup of spent fuel rods, and that it was not motivated by radiological safety concerns. So the case goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court upholds the California law. And in doing so, the court accepted the state's economic purpose and held that the law was outside the preemptive scope of the Atomic Energy Act. The court held that Congress had intended for the continued dual regulation of nuclear-powered electricity generation. Congress assigned the regulation of safety issues exclusively to the federal government, but the state governments retained their traditional role in regulating electric utilities. And part of regulating electric utilities and rates is a calculation of the costs associated with generating that power. The court noted that there were two areas in which preemption prohibited state regulation. Conflict preemption prohibits state regulation of the construction and operation of a nuclear power plant, given that the Federal Nuclear Regulatory Commission has a, quote, exclusive authority over plant construction and operation. Also, field preemption prohibits state regulation motivated by radiological safety concerns, because under the Atomic Energy Act, the federal government, the court said, has occupied the entire field of nuclear safety concerns. Because the California law was based on potential economic consequences of the buildup of nuclear waste, and rather than based on some safety issue associated with that buildup, the law, according to the Supreme Court, did not fall within the prohibited field. The court said that the progress made on storing nuclear waste was sufficient to allow for the continued licensing of nuclear facilities, but the court made clear that safe operation was not synonymous with economically efficient operation. So the court let the California law stand. And as I said, Pacific Gas remains the authoritative case in assessing the preemptive scope of the Atomic Energy Act. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chelsi. Welcome back.
I'm glad to be back. We have till 3:25?
Yes.
Okay, great. So today we're going to be talking about arguments for and against various nuclear technologies. Talking a little bit about the nuance. This will be more fast-paced than the last session. And really the hope here is that you'll be prepared for the panel that we have this coming Monday. Quick recap. Last time we learned about the nuclear fuel cycle, the various impacts, that nuclear has been heralded as a firm, dispatchable baseload power source, that the US does not have an operational waste disposal facility, whether that be temporary or permanent. That Indigenous peoples continue to bear the brunt of the impacts both of the extraction from mining and the ultimate radioactive waste. Many of these communities don't get to experience the benefit of nuclear power while it's operating as well. We also talked a bit about climate impacts and how climate disasters will have an increasing effect on nuclear power, and also acknowledged that there's room for improvement. We haven't sorted this technology out in the least. I'd like to start out with asking if any of you have clarification questions before we get started, based on what you learned last week. Okay, great. If you have any other aspects of nuclear power that you're interested in, we can address that one. Okay, other questions that you have for the panel? My email will be here, as is the professor's, and this will be in the final slides. So feel free to email us these questions, and we're really happy to be able to have specific questions of interest to you in the law. I have two clarifications, and any of these links that you see underlined in this final presentation are links. So the first is that somebody asked last time, what is the water use like and what are the cooling options alternative to water? This video from the Government Accountability Office answers that question. The second is about how does nuclear power relate to the water loss from hydrologic dams? And the answer is complicated because dams involve a multitude of uses, including recreation, water use for communities. And the answers are on this page with US Geological Survey. Someone also asked if groundwater is used for nuclear, and I asked an expert, and he said it would be a real waste. This is a graph from the US Geological Survey, and the part that I circled, which is minuscule, is the amount that was used back in 1955. It's possible that there's tiny little slivers on the bottom of some of these charts, but it really isn't a good use of water. Okay, so today's learning objective is to become familiar with the nuance of the debate for and against nuclear. I want to start off by saying this is the part that I find least motivating. I'm happy to share it. I think that I have a broad number of stories that will help you to better understand. But this part of the discussion about nuclear power is not particularly thrilling. Okay, I get that. So I hope that this at least helps give you better context. Same expectations as last time. Speak up, help make sure this isn't boring for me or you, and recognize that there are so many other people who are working on this issue. I know for sure that I don't have it sorted out. I'm doing my best to give you better knowledge so that you can confront these issues as well. But it will take all of us to solve this. And so we'll start with some of this engagement. I'd like you to raise your hand if you learned something something new in the last session. Okay, that's good. Just about everyone. If you shared something that you learned last week with someone else, quite a bit, just about half of you. That's cool. So you're talking about this and you were able to use it. If you're joining class today eager to learn more about this topic. Okay, everyone, yay. That makes my job easy. If you shifted your perspectives on nuclear power one way or the other, even if it was a little bit. Okay, probably half of you again. And my last question is, how many of you plan on practicing environmental or energy law? So what, roughly a third or so? Okay, well, one of the things is that I acknowledge that the people in this room, you may go on to work in this space. And that's really cool for me to know that this knowledge may be useful to you in your career. Okay, today's focus. Like I mentioned, we're going to talk about the spectrum of positions on nuclear power, the various nuclear intermittency issues that are emerging, especially as it relates to water. Very basic information on the advanced reactors that are coming out. Ways to approach thinking about those advanced reactors with critical thinking. Some social theories on the flaws of nuclear and how you can work to separate fact from fiction when you're reading through articles that include marketing about nuclear. Now, I'm giving you a very in-depth look at the critique because you can go out on Google and read any number of articles on the technology itself. You don't need me to stand up here and talk to you about that. That's easy. The harder part is sorting through what people don't talk about in public. Okay, are there any other aspects you want to tack on to this or that you'd like to hear about on Monday? Okay. Pretty comprehensive. So here's some of the trade-offs and the challenges that we touched on last time. Trade-offs, obviously cost, time, carbon, similar to what you read about in Amory Levin's piece. When you're considering nuclear, you're also considering the alternative technologies that you might use instead, often fossil fuels, and what the air quality impacts of those power plants are. The trade-offs of how much water you're using at these power plants, the various levels of risk when you're generating electricity, the impact to the habitats that are surrounding these areas, and the long-term pollution. Some of the challenges that we have touched on as it relates specifically to nuclear are that the existing reactors in the US are getting older. They have limited engineering design lives. There's a negative perception for a variety of reasons, largely due to the number of historical nuclear accidents globally. There's a declining workforce related to those negative perceptions, likely. There's containment issues, and then there's also climate issues as time goes on. Are there any other challenges that you've read, seen, uncovered? No one? Okay, so moving on to the three approaches, three positions. There is such a wide spectrum of how people feel about nuclear, and I'm just boiling it down to three. Generally, people either want to build more, they want to extend the life of the existing plants, so a handful of environmental groups are in that space, and then other folks just want to close down all of them and not build anymore. I could be up here for hours talking to you about all the different people that fit in between, and the different folks that I'm going to share with you in this presentation also fit in the in-between. But these are some of the approaches that you should be aware of when you're exploring these issues. Again, we're going to talk about arguments in favor, arguments for those opposed, some of the science, which is more of my background, and then piecing through some of the marketing issues. Okay, first we'll go into the folks who are fans of nuclear. And when we're thinking about this, let's start with the billionaires. We have Bill Gates, Elon Musk, Bloomberg, and there's actually one more. Warren Buffett's also on this list, but there wasn't enough room to fit him on here. So Warren Buffett's working with Bill Gates on the plan in Wyoming. And next, there's more of the politicos. Cory Booker, Senator Cory Booker's a big fan. That is former Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz, current Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm, and then this is Ken Caldera, who's a former professor at Stanford and is now at Carnegie University. Okay, so what stands out about this list? Come Someone raise your hand. Go ahead. They're all powerful people. What else? The back.
Higher average representation of billionaires.
Okay, there's billionaires, a lot of billionaires. Okay, they appear environmentally conscious. Interesting. Comment? Yes? That's an interesting point. You've seen these people have an interest in electricity or experience in business with electricity?
So then at least they would see the need for that as a bridge fuel.
Okay, nuclear is a bridge fuel. Interesting. Anyone else? Over there? They're older than average. Okay. That's it? They're mostly white and they're mostly men. Yes. It's hard to find women, indigenous folks, Black, brown, folks in other countries that support nuclear. They exist, but for the most part, a lot of the folks that are working on nuclear, investing in nuclear look like this list. The organizations that support nuclear and work to advance it from an advocacy perspective, some of them are on this list. I chose a few groups domestically and a few that are international. Does anyone recognize any of these groups? Yeah, head shakes. Okay. So I'm a visual person and I appreciate being able to see visuals. So I pulled up all of their logos. And one thing you'll notice is there's a lot of blue, there's a lot of like edgy lines. It's very neat, very put together. In addition to science, I like to read a bit about design and psychology. So blue is a calming color, a color that's associated with positive feelings. And in the marketing world, they use it to show confidence. So I find it really interesting that just from this few groups that I chose, there's blue in nearly every single one of their logos. Now, has anyone heard of Mothers for Nuclear? No. Okay, so I don't know a whole lot about them. I know that many of the people that are involved work at nuclear plants, or they're women who learned about coal plants and learned about fossil fuel and became very passionate about nuclear as a solution to the issues that plague our cities in particular. But their logo is a mom and a child inside of an electron cloud of a radioactive atom. And I, for one, do not want to be inside of that electron cloud. So I've always thought it was really interesting that that's the marketing that they chose, because and maybe it goes with their message that they feel it's very safe. It just puzzles me. I pulled a quote from Bill Gates, and Bill says, nuclear is ideal for dealing with climate change because it is the only carbon-free, scalable energy source that's available 24 hours a day. He goes on to say, the problems with today's reactors, such as the risk of accidents, can be solved through innovation. I find that really interesting. Given what we learned from the last session on the Alley's work that I mentioned from the book Too Hot to Touch, innovation is not something we've really seen over the last 60 or so years. So I wonder what innovation he's talking about, because we haven't solved some of those risks of storage in that time. Any questions on folks for nuclear before we move on? Okay, critics or folks that are skeptical. This list, again, there's a spectrum. Maybe they're not fully opposed. Maybe they're only partially opposed. Maybe they're only opposed in certain circumstances, like internationally. I did the best I could with finding people who fit the definition of being skeptical. Okay, so we'll start with the scientists. This is Arjun Makajani, Amory Levins, who we read last week, Helen Caldecott, a physician, the scholars, the artists. Anyone know Hayao Miyazaki? Yeah, lots of head shakes. And then Bruce Springsteen. Okay, so, and that's Winona LaDuke on the bottom right. Now, looking at this list, what do you notice?
A lot more diverse than the previous.
A lot more diverse.
That's kind of a broad one, but I feel like people have, and like critics in general, have like a whole different conception of like humans and the environment and the relationship between, like I feel like, whereas like components of the pyramid are like a lot about extraction and like that kind of relationship, like these sort of like, you know, that just works very like, we're all part of like one ecosystem. So it's a whole different way of like organizing society with those environmental.
Appreciate that. The human environmental relationship is different likely between these people.
Like their backgrounds are like outside or just not like plain like the others who are like a typical professional photo. It's more appealing.
Yeah, so their backgrounds are outside of the energy space. Anyone else?
Because with being incredibly anti-nuclear, nuclear weapons essentially. So like the idea of nuclear energy, even though it's obviously quite powerful from nuclear weapons, would be incredibly unpopular public decision. In addition to. So I wonder, like, I don't know if you like really what happening.
Absolutely. So you're making the comment about New Zealand, how there's countries of the world that would likely fit on this list as well. And later on, I'll touch on the military industrial complex and the connection to weapons. Several of the folks on the list are also very outspoken in their opposition to nuclear weapons. Okay, so some of the groups, I did my best to find complementary inverses of the groups that I showed you prior. Recognize these groups? Again, some are domestic. There's some that are also international. And here's their logos. A lot more in your face, different colors. You've got green, symbolizing life, growth. You've got some red, and a lot of black and white. So I think that this is an interesting aspect to consider, how we are consuming information from different places and what are the things that are coming with that? What are the emotions? What's the psychology behind the lesson? Okay, a quote from an engineer. We're going to have to solve the climate change problem if we're going to have nuclear power, not the other way around. Someone tell me what you think Mr. Lochbaum means.
I think because if the environmental destruction keeps going on, just like, for example, sea level rise, and the picture of the nuclear facility showed to us last week, it's going to be more disaster countries rather than solution to the energy problem that we have right now.
Climate disasters impacting it. That's a big part of my previous work, looking at what it looks like when you do have sea level rise and radioactive waste stored somewhere. Someone else?
Kind of similarly, but based on the articles we read today, that it just might not, even if there's not a disaster, just the water resources that it will take to use nuclear power might not really be as available as they are now, and so it might not, with climate change happening, it might not be as feasible of an option.
Right. Water issues. So David Lochbaum formerly was the director of nuclear safety at Union of Concerned Scientists. He's also a nuclear engineer, so he has decades of experience working at plants. And he's someone who I've learned a lot about the nuclear water nexus. So yes, he's referring in large part to the water issues. And this idea that nuclear power is a solution for climate change, I'm sure you've all been exposed to this. The part that you don't often hear about is the issues with water. And that's the reason why a lot of the readings that we've selected focus on that. Any questions before we move on to the science portions? Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about some of the pressures that are on nuclear and where problems have arisen, specifically in the case example of San Onofre, the plant that I have the most experience studying, and also a place here in California that we could relate to fairly well. Before I get into that, I'm going to talk quickly about some scientists at UC San Diego. So these scientists are atmospheric chemists. All of these colors on the map is the aftermath of Fukushima. This is atmospheric radiation from the plant, and it was traced moving around the world. It's well known that particles move across the Earth's atmosphere. Sand from the Sahara every year comes through the atmosphere to the East Coast. There's these interactions are always happening. So these scientists, they're well experienced in this area. And when Fukushima happened, they said, let's watch. Let's see when we get the readings. As you can see, it was measured from La Jolla near San Diego. That's why all those rainbow colors are going down to Southern California. It took 5 days for that atmospheric radiation to reach California from Fukushima. And the interesting thing about this, if you're into science, is that the method that they used traced a specific radioactive tag, and that tag goes right back to the material used at Fukushima. They were able to even quantify the amount of reactor damage based on the calculations and the measurements that they took. Now, it's my understanding anecdotally, of course, and I'm not the person who worked on this nor wrote these papers, but it's my understanding that nobody wanted to publish this. And another interesting aspect of it is, I shouldn't say nobody because it did get published, but it got published on the reputation of the authors in a journal that is only accessible to scientists of a certain caliber. Okay. The interesting thing is that they were able to calculate and estimate how much damage happened before the experts did anywhere in the world that were specifically working on the reaction to Fukushima. So the question of, can we do better on detection? Can we do better on measurements? Well, they did. They proved it. What they did with the data afterwards is that they compared that method with what was going on just a few miles north at San Onofre nuclear plant. What was found is that their metrics for the radiation air monitoring were between 100 and 1,000 times more sensitive than what the nuclear plant owner, the utility, Southern California Edison, was using. So what I want to kind of break through to you here is that the science exists. What's regulated is a really low bar. And unfortunately, what we found in the work that I did prior is that based on the best science that we have available, the technology that's being used at nuclear plants around the United States is insufficient to detect and address radiation leaks of radioactive waste storage in particular. So I want to give you a better idea of San Onofre itself. San Onofre is about midway between San Diego and Los Angeles. This pictured here is one of the best surf breaks in the whole world. And you can barely see them, but there's a lot of surfers there in the lineup. Do we have any surfers here? Not one. Okay, so basically this place is very much like a spiritual place for surfers. Likewise, it's a very sacred place for Indigenous folks who have cared for this land for over 10,000 years. This is my friend, Sarah Brady, and her family has been surfing this break for 3 generations. This is one of my favorite pictures to communicate the issue because you really get a feel for the fact that these surf spots are right next to where the nuclear plant sends out irradiated water that has gone through the system. It's not possible to filter out all of the radiation, namely tritium, which is chemically very similar to water. So Sarah also works in this space of environmental activism, of advocacy. She's very politically involved. And what I find so inspiring about her is that she's been able to turn videos and art into communication pieces for expressing this. And she gets to do it with something she's passionate about, something she loves. She's now a professional surfer, and you can catch her on Instagram, and also she runs an advocacy Instagram called Save Sano. I'm gonna use this to roll us into a couple more stories. So San Onofre is sort of this microcosm of the nuclear industry, of their game plan, and of the regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and how they are a captured regulator, and they're very cozy with the industry, like many other regulators at various levels of government. Before we get into that, I want to remind you of 2 engineering concepts that are really important here. Design life, we're talking about the period of time that you're expected to use a certain thing, for example, the canisters or the reactors themselves, and redundancy, which, do we have engineers in the room? Anyone? We have one. Redundancy is looking at reliability and ensuring that you have reliability through multiple plan Bs, multiple failure options, so that you're unlikely to have failure after failure after failure, although that did happen in Fukushima. So even the best engineering is insufficient at times. It's really important that you understand the concepts of design life and redundancy, whether it's nuclear power or anything else. These are concepts that are extremely important, especially when things go wrong. So back to the question about homeless labor. I'm sure this isn't unique to San Onofre, but it did make it into the news in the early 80s. The utility, Southern California Edison, and their contractors sought out the labor of homeless folks in beach communities of San Diego. Again, all of these are linked, so if you want to go back and read the articles later, you're free to. The headline says, "Friends say they have that certain glow." And the article is chilling. These people that were brought up by the hundreds, maybe even over 1,000, were rotated in and out of the steam generator to clean them. They were only able to be in that space for minutes at a time. And they were compensated at $500 a week back in 1980s. So it's a pretty penny. And they also had to sign a contract that said that they were not going to sue the utility if they became sterile. This is the kind of history that you are exposed to when you confront these issues. They also were frightened for their safety because they went to the NRC and spoke out about their experience in advance of units 2 and 3, 2 more reactors being built at San Onofre. The second thing I wanted to mention is that in this series of errors is that Bechtel installed the reactor backwards. It was a big embarrassment for this company. And from this article in Time, I wanted to mention that they also were involved in the design and the construction of the Bay Bridge. So my question was, before or after the earthquake? These issues aren't just siloed. They're not just one or the other. So I want to remind you that what we see with engineering, what we see with the politics, the social issues, they're all intertwined. The third thing is I wanted to really acknowledge the people whose land this plant is on, the Hachiman people. This is Starman, who is within and part of their creation story. Now, this is, you probably can't tell, but those are people that lined up and created Starman through an activism effort on the beach, right near where the waste is. Something that's really hard to conceptualize, but that we struggle with here at Berkeley as well, is that someone involved on that Bechtel team, an archaeologist named Brock, stole remains that he came in contact with when he worked on the San Onofre project, took them back to his home in Maryland, kept them, and when he died, they were returned to the Hachiman people. I want you to sit with that, because this isn't unique. And these people had no choice in what happened to their land. Most of it now is a marine base and the nuclear plant itself. So it's been permanently changed in a lot of ways. They also have been very active legally to return and remediate various issues that have affected their peoples. The fourth thing is the failed steam generator issue. So I mentioned that there are 3 different units at San Onofre. In addition to homeless folks being brought in to clean Unit 1 steam generators, the steam generators that were replaced in the other units, the more recently constructed units, well, something strange happened with them. It's not so common to replace these steam generators, to my understanding, and they ended up having decades of wear within months. Now, no one really knows what happened. Was it truly Mitsubishi, the manufacturer, who gave San Onofre owners defective steam generators? Or did Southern California Edison alter the steam generator system in some way that perhaps would increase efficiency, and instead they made a mistake that caused them to quickly and rapidly wear down? Now, it wouldn't be uncommon, this is pretty standard in the nuclear industry, for corners to be cut so permits from the regulator do not have to be sought out. Any questions on that before we move into water? Okay, so we talked a little bit about this. You read these reports. Huge amounts of fresh water are being used from lakes, rivers, and then saline water from the ocean for power plants. We mentioned this also, that the water that's discharged is warmer because it's used to cool the power plant itself. And something important that I wanted to pull out from the report you read on water is that over the last 30 or so years, the population of the Southwest, excluding California, is expected to double. And so that means more and more water in a water-starved region is expected to be used. More and more power plants need to be built. We're really running into an issue of money scarcity, water scarcity, power plants. What are we going to do? Where are we going to go? This map I found particularly interesting because it shows the stresses that we're expecting as time goes on. This is in 8 years, 2030. what I find really shocking is that even in water-rich New England, we're seeing orange and red, which is medium, high, high, and then even in some areas, extremely high water stress for power plants. So even those places are not exempt from the concept of changing water fluxes. This data relates both to fossil fuels and nuclear plants. Yeah.
Would you mind explaining like what the extremely high, greater than 80%, what it actually means in terms of what power plant water stress is, like what power plants are experiencing? Like, I'm just a little bit confused about what this is.
Sure. So I believe that the data is focused on how often they are experiencing those stresses. And so it's increasing at these rates. And I imagine that the context of the study we can look at and kind of pull forward exactly what they mean. But what we're seeing here is unprecedented. And from what we've read with Union of Concerned Scientists, in particular, Southwest, Southeast are the areas of highest concern, but this is showing us that Midwest and New England is also at risk.
You mentioned earlier about water only is similar to water.
Tritium.
Okay. So are you suggesting that the water is safe? Water coming out from the sun is safe? Okay, the temperature is warmer, yes, but can I say that it will get cooler by the time? I mean, 1 hour, 2 hours after the discharge, and since it is similar to water, then it's safe for the environment. Am I correct?
So the question is it safe, the radiation releases from plants? So we mentioned this, that radiation from nuclear plants is released to the air, water, and land. That's well understood. When you're releasing it to the water, the expectation is that it will dilute. But radioactivity remains in the environment for hundreds, if not thousands of years, depending on the isotope. And it's cumulative, so it can gather in plants, gather in fish, gather in the sand, gather in the water. When you talk about safety, you have to think about who's defining the regulations, how often they're changing. Regulations of this sort, as I'm sure you've studied in other classes, they're like a moving goalpost. After Fukushima, the regulations changed. What was the safe exposure? Well, all of a sudden you can be exposed to a whole lot more radiation. The question of safety, while preempted, is also one that you'll never get a pure answer. But being exposed to radiation is not safe. And putting yourself right next to where the water effluent comes out of a plant, well, I don't want to be there. So you have to really think about that and also consider that all of our water systems on Earth are connected through various biogeochemical cycles. So are we comfortable with putting out any radiation, any pollution into the atmosphere? These are risks and trade-offs that we have to consider.
Is there any, so if the plumes of steam that are come from these power plants or they react, right? Just to some extent. Is there any thought put into how steam released by the power plant might sort of accumulate in certain geographic areas, much like weather patterns break? Because it's not like, yes, it's being released to the atmosphere, so the water isn't being diluted with the whole supply of water. It's being diluted with, you know, the local rainfall, right? Because it's kind of staying there, and it could just join up with local weather patterns that are happening right then and there, and then through that first part of the plant. So it's not like you see what I'm saying here. Like it's not like the coefficient's that big, right? We're sort of calculating how much dilution that takes place. It seems like it could be in certain instances much smaller and therefore much more potent.
Yeah, it's also a question of can you study it? So the comment is about plumes of steam that are released and how it may accumulate, and that's something that we can bring to the panel. The thing that concerns me is you look at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, they have a 50-mile evacuation zone for active plants in the event of an emergency, nuclear accident, the like. That's related to the atmospheric plumes. When I'm talking about the effluent, I'm specifically talking about water that filters through the plant and then goes back out into the water source, likely lake, river, ocean. What wind patterns are something to consider. Where is this blowing? At San Onofre, it's really simple. You're getting a lot of onshore winds, and so it's blowing east. I personally wouldn't want to live due east of that plant. So yes, these are things to think about, not just from a perspective of being a lawyer, not just to the perspective of being someone who cares about the environment and these issues, but also from the perspective of just being a person. These are issues that affect all of us. Whether we're pro-nuclear, whether we're against nuclear, you have to really wrestle with these various pollutions. Any other questions? Okay, so we see that water is a stress as it relates to power plants. So now we'll move into some of the marketing. So the emerging technologies, this is about as good of an example as I can give you. The source paper is here, and it talks about the emerging generation 4 reactors. Right now, most of our plants are generation 2. If you remember, those are the 60s, 70s technology. And countries in Europe have made advances and have deployed further technology into the generation 3. And then generation 4, we're looking at these advanced reactors, small modular reactors, and the like. Okay, so you can see that we're making kind of a big jump technology-wise. And this is why a lot of people are excited about it. And there's a reason to be excited. It's a very fascinating technology. I wanted to mention what I call dreams, advanced reactor dreams, because we're so far away, in my opinion, of seeing them come to be. These are the 3 projects that have been proposed, funded heavily by the government, and are getting a lot of attention in the press. Again, these are all linked, so you can check them out. The dates that are here in the parentheses are these projected operation dates. Now, this is if everything goes right. If everything goes right, if we have all of the money, if we don't run into any construction issues, which has never happened in the nuclear world, but if everything goes perfect, this is what we're looking at for the plants coming online. Has anyone heard of TerraPower? Yeah. Who runs TerraPower? Yeah, Bill Gates. So before I move on to talking about Bill Gates, I wanted to mention that one of the issues that's coming up and was highlighted by folks at Union of Concerned Scientists is that these smaller, in quotes, smaller, because they're not that small, these reactors are expected to be closer to population centers as opposed to the other sites that we covered in the last session. Conventional reactors intentionally were placed further from population centers as a protective factor. If there was an emergency, it's easier to get people outside of evacuation zones. You're not having all of that risk concentrated. Now with these reactors, these advanced reactors, they don't produce as much energy. You have to have more of them, and they're likely to be sited closer to population centers. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is anxious about that, rightfully so. So I would highly recommend reading that link that says siting closer to population centers if you have interest in this. So TerraPower, Bill Gates' new project. It's a natrium reactor, and you can ask the panelists all about the specifics on these reactors. But if you try to ask me, I won't be able to tell you all of the specifics. So we'll save those questions. It's based in Wyoming. Bill Gates, Warren Buffett working on it together with a team of a lot of other folks. And the goal here is very involved. So they want to take this coal town, replace those jobs with nuclear, then use that nuclear and other technology associated for storage, then kind of bake into the option to have hydrogen generation on site as well, and provide power for extractive mining. That's a lot of things packed into one project. Okay. Huh?
And there is this, there really feels like they mentioned that it could be sort of cheap energy generation, water desalination. They compare water-based plants in San Francisco to the extent capacity to what the application can do. So, but whereas we in the previous study we saw that all these three different plants are whereas the applicant is finding they're using 2025, they are so is one of my questions is the applicant a second generation and is there any weight to that argument that is coming out from
So it's my understanding that it is Gen 2. It might actually be that picture. Well, it's not this picture, but it's their other picture in this report. So yeah, I'm fairly certain, but again, I'm not a nuclear physicist or engineer. The second question about sort of weight to the argument for Diablo Canyon to continue on and produce cheap hydrogen, I'll give you my insight, and then I think this is a great question to ask the panelists on Monday. One of the reasons why Diablo Canyon is shutting down, it's not just because people are complaining about it and wanting it to close. It's because it's reaching an advanced portion of its life, and they would need to apply for new licenses. They would have to make updates. They would have to pay a lot of money for safety upgrades. And frankly, PG&E doesn't want to do it. And you'll find that in some of the reports. It's sort of the between the lines, subtle comments that are made. So from that standpoint, I really don't think that it makes financial sense for the company to continue forward betting on creating hydrogen. But it's not something I study, so I can't really give you a substantial argument of whether it's valid as an approach. Dr. Yatsko might be able to say something more. But it is interesting that there are these intersections between the new technologies, and it's not dissimilar from the intersections that exist today with various power plants. We're seeing that with water. Something I want to touch on is that nuclear and fossil fuel plants, while they've been pitted against each other in some ways, nuclear-based companies have learned a lot from the fossil fuel game plan. So you'll notice a lot of similarities between how they do things. It gets to be pretty grimy and hard to be around when you're witnessing the tactics that they use. And for me, that's something really disconcerting. If nuclear is this bright, shining thing, why do we have to resort to some of these tactics of harm? And it just seems like a whole waste of time. An basic update on this plan in Wyoming for TerraPower is that they are currently applying for construction licenses. So that means the NRC is reviewing, they will soon review their plans and look at if they get the green light to go and start construction or not. That would mean, again, everything going perfectly. That's why there's all those question marks, is construction would start in 2024. A price tag of roughly $4 billion. Again, everything going well. And so far, the US government through Department of Energy has already pledged over $2 billion. So over half of it. I don't think Bill Gates needs the government to help his project, but we are subsidizing his project. And that's not unlike most other power issues, power plant issues, especially in the nuclear field. There's significant amount of subsidies for existing plants as well. So this is the image from the reading in science, and that 2-page reading, it's dense, I know, you're law students for the most part, but it was really earth-shattering in a lot of ways because it looked at the marketing for advanced reactors and it said, is it true? Are they more efficient? Are they cheaper? Are they better at using waste? And what the authors came out with is not so much. There's some critiques that are baked into those marketing questions. And this is an article that I've revisited over time. What they found is that these advanced reactors produce more waste per unit of energy than the conventional reactors that we have right now. And from a economies of scale perspective, that makes a whole lot of sense. Bigger things, you're able to more effectively and efficiently use the material. Smaller mechanisms like the advanced reactors, you can't have that same economy of scale. But you don't ever hear that. You hear the opposite. So that's something that I take issue with in the marketing. Not everyone has a science background. Not everyone has the time to critically think about these issues. These are the issues that I'm passing off to you to consider as you go forward in your work. Okay, so some of the social theory. I think it's really important to talk about this. And again, this is the stuff that you won't hear in articles, on TV, and the interviews, but I'm comfortable talking about it. So nuclear power is buoyed up by capitalism. These decisions are all based on making a profit, on appeasing your shareholders, on ensuring that money is circulating. The labor exploitation, we learned an example of the vulnerable folks who were brought in to clean up the reactor in very experimental ways that hadn't been tested or proven before. There's also a lot of issues with whistleblowers and the intimidation that goes on at many of these companies. There's a lot of patriarchy running through nuclear. And you saw that through the folks that support it, through the folks that work on the science. I am one of the few women in any of the rooms that I've ever been in on this issue. Sarah Brady, also one of the few women that shows up. Leona Morgan from the Dene Nation, she goes to COP and stands in front of people and shares her story. It's not easy. And I think that that's a big reason why we have some of the gaps that we have, especially as it relates to waste. The decisions that were made with a capitalist lens and looking at the future and the scientific fantasy of what nuclear could be, those were men that were making these decisions. And I feel very confident that women, mothers, aunties would not have made those same decisions. And namely, most of those women, aunties, mothers are the ones who are working to clean up the mess now. Colonialism, we talked about nuclear colonialism a bit, comes back to the land that the materials are built on, the places where mining occurs, and the issues going forward with waste storage. Genocide, again, we're talking about the vulnerable folks that are working in these plants, effectively sacrificing these people's health, the workers themselves that are at plants right now. I didn't mention this, but my uncle actually welded many of the pipes of the nuclear plants here in California throughout the West. And his friends, he had a friend who actually fell into a pool of the radioactive water, and he's still alive. But these are things that happen. And so the idea that people are expendable, that the indigenous folks on these lands are expendable is woven into the nuclear industry. No one will get up on a podium and say that to you. And the military industrial complex. Now, historians that study this issue have gone to great depths to explain this, but nuclear power and nuclear weapons, as your colleague mentioned earlier, are inextricably linked. Nuclear power provided a lot of the material that's used in the nuclear weapons. So when I first started working on this, I thought, oh, could that really be so true? Isn't that a hyperbole? And no, it's not. There are very direct links, and there are reasons that certain new technologies are tested at the national labs, and they're all related and intertwined. And the last is nuclear imperialism. Having weapons and not having weapons. How does that change your negotiation standpoint in geopolitics? What we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine, we're seeing aspects of nuclear imperialism as well. So these are things that they're critical to keep in mind, critical to think about. And while they probably won't make up your whole career, and you may not agree with all of them, they do exist. And I encourage you to consider aspects like this in any portion of your work, nuclear or unrelated. So I do want to touch on some of the other things that we've talked about over these last two sessions, that utilities are making many of these decisions as it relates to designs of reactors, designs of equipment, how they manage the sites, what facilities they build for radioactive waste storage, what materials are used to store the waste. They're leading the charge. The federal regulator, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, responds with a lot of slaps on the wrist, things that just don't have teeth in them when it comes to conflicts. We have a government who's fairly bewildered and very avoidant of the mess that has come to be known as the waste storage issues. A judicial system that defers to the utility and the regulator when things make it to the courts, which is extremely problematic if you don't have a recourse for the issues that are occurring. And who's left on the hook? At the end of the day, the people paying for all of these issues are the ratepayers who got the electricity from each of these plants, and then all taxpayers, because all of us paid into Yucca Mountain, that $16 billion permanent disposal proposed site that is not being used. So it's our money that's used in this way. Again, it's our money that's used to subsidize the plants. And so we ought to know a bit about it to understand just how the enormity of this money that's getting thrown around. So I want to sort of leave you thinking about the importance of analyzing the life cycle costs back to the nuclear fuel cycle. We're talking about the whole thing, the before and the after, not just the operation. So when you're looking at this issue or others, really consider that full life cycle analysis. It's important to seek out sources independent of influence on either side and recognize when you're being influenced, who's paying for the press releases that you're seeing, who's paying for the journals that you're reading from or the magazines that you're reading from. Doing your own math per unit energy, like you saw in the science article. You can't just believe everything that's written down. Important to consider social impacts of the technologies, see the interconnection of electricity and all of the cycles that happen on Earth and how the water cycle is related to power plant systems, and recognize that there's always room for improvement. Some people in this space will tell you that it's a lost cause. And the truth is, nothing ever really is. And with nuclear, there will be a team of somebody somewhere that will come up with the answers that we need. And none of us really know what it's going to take to tip the debate. Who's going to solve it? When we'll really reckon with it and care, when our Congress and other agencies in our government will really start to take up this issue. I hope it's in our lifetime, but I'm not holding my breath. Here's your summary of learning objectives, and I hope you all are ready to learn from Dr. Gregory Yatsko and Jeff Fettis on Monday.